Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to come talk to you. Um, I'm excited to talk to you just about my research, but also excited to hear even just some of your experiences as members of an atheist organization. I'll just tell you a teeny little bit about myself. I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, which is maybe not the first place that you think of when you think of somebody who studies secularism and non-religion, but Notre Dame actually has my advisor has two advisors. My advisors were arguably some of the largest experts in the country on religion and politics. So I came there to study religion and politics, and particularly actually to study secularism, especially secularism in the United States. So that's kind of how I began my journey studying non-religion, secularism, atheism, agnosticism in the US, and particularly its link to politics. So I went from there. I taught at the University of Southern Mississippi last year, and now I'm at Syracuse University in a really kind of interesting position as a faculty fellow in both the religion and political science department. So that's where I am right now, and I'm really, like I said, really happy that Judy asked me to talk to you today. And definitely, please feel free to stop me anytime with questions. You can even you can raise your hand. You can yell at me. You can type something in the chat. Don't worry, you can't possibly be as disruptive as my undergrads, although maybe you want to give it a shot. But let me share my screen here, and I'll kind of outline what I wanted to talk to you about today. Can everybody see my screen? Great. Okay, so the thing I'd like to talk to you about today is sort of my current main research program, the main thing that I research, and that is secular activism in American politics. So how are seculars becoming active in politics, and especially what that means for party politics. So I'll sort of give you my spiel, but then I have a couple different directions to go based on kind of what everyone's interested in. So I'll give you sort of it's like going on its own. That's weird. Okay, so I'll give you just a kind of, I'll do my spiel. And again, feel free to ask questions or stop me or anything at any time. And then I have definitely a couple different things that I'll cover at the end that I can talk more about or answer questions about or discuss more, kind of based on what folks are interested in. So you may or may not know that the American religious landscape is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. So if you focus on that, I know this is sort of a busy graph, but if you focus on that line, that red line at the top, that line is just tracking the percentage of the population that identifies or that we classify as evangelical Christian. And it does it over time. So it's going from here, 1972, all the way up to 2018. And in fact, each one of these lines is simply, tracking the percentage of the population that are members of each one of these different religious groups, or at least our classifications of these religious groups. So you can see there at the top, the red and the dark blue lines. Evangelicals and Catholics are always at the top and have been certainly since 1972, maintaining 20, 25%, even up to 30% of the American population. You can see that kind of lightish blue line are mainline Protestants, and they have sort of been steadily declining over time, which we kind of expect and is sort of in line with even other countries. But if you notice one line, I think at least to me, stands out, and this is probably not new information to you, but those that don't identify with a religious tradition or identify as agnostic or atheist on this sort of nationally representative survey that they do are rising sharply as a percentage of the American population, from about 7% in 1990 to now being the largest, barely the largest group defined by religious tradition in the United States. So I'm going to say that again because I think it's revolutionary. In 2018, or at least on the 2018 General Social Survey, which is usually how we kind of measure what percentage of the population belongs to each religious tradition. So in 2018, people with no religion, or what I would broadly call secularists, have surpassed evangelical Christians, have surpassed Catholics to become the largest sort of group defined by a religious tradition in the American religious landscape. And this change is also political. So this is simply a graph of Democrats and their religious affiliation in 2007 and in 2014. So this comes from the Pew Forum, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a really great, okay, there's something in the chat already. Somebody's interrupting already, which is great. And the source of the survey again, so that's the General Social Survey. It's out of Newark at the University of Chicago. Very standard survey that's conducted almost every year since 1972. Sort of a huge omnibus survey, very reliable. It's essentially one of our standard surveys in social science. So this graph is simply a breakdown of the Democratic Party by religious tradition. So that bottom kind of bar that you can see is in 2007. So really not that long ago, just 13 years ago. And you can see that unaffiliated or secular or non-religious Americans made up 19% of the Democratic Party. So if you think about all Democrats in 2007, 19% were not affiliated or secular or non-religious. Now, just 7 years later in 2014, that number had gone up by 9 percentage points to 28%. So now secular or non-religious Americans are not only the largest sort of group defined by religious tradition in America as a whole, but they're also the largest group by a lot defined by a religious tradition in the Democratic Party. So they have a huge presence in the Democratic Party, at least when we think about just demographics, So typically, again, you think about the Democratic Party, and this might not be news to anybody. I mean, we sort of think about the Democratic Party as secular or non-religious, at least in comparison to the Republican Party. But I think it's worth really kind of hitting home the point that this is a huge group, right? Over a quarter of Democrats are non-religious or unaffiliated. And this, like I said, this comes from the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, another very high quality survey of the American population. But there's sort of a really crazy problem. And again, this might not be news to anybody that's been involved in politics and is also a secular individual. But despite seculars making up 28% of the population. So again, look to that top bar, and that 28% that's gray in the middle there is the percentage of, again, the percentage of Democrats in the general public that are non-religious. So despite this overwhelming presence, I would argue, even if you just lump all Protestants together, presence of seculars in the Democratic Party, they essentially have zero representation in Congress. So there are currently, although this might actually change quite soon, there are currently only one member of Congress, Jamie Raskin, that really has come out as secular and identifies openly as secular. So again, despite making up a huge chunk of the Democratic Party, they have essentially no representation. And this is the House of Representatives, but also, the Senate, it's a similar story. So there's this huge representation gap. You think of other groups and things like, you might have heard the term descriptive representation. So often that's used to say, oh, well, people of color make up a certain percentage of the population, but they don't have a lot of representation in Congress. Well, if you kind of look at it that way, people who are non-religious make up a huge percentage of the Democratic Party and even the population in general, and have essentially no representation in Congress. All right, cool, another question. I'm only doing good questions. But wouldn't we expect the shift in representation to be slowly reflected since the change in the group has moved only within the last 7 years? So that's Gary. Great question, Gary. Gary is like on top of it. Really good question. Gary, I have given this presentation to a lot of academics And that's definitely of the top like 3 questions that I've ever gotten. So first, I would say that this shift has happened over really the last 30 years. And it's really kind of come to a head in the last, as you say, 7 to 10, even sort of 10 to 15 years. But if you compare seculars with other groups that have also gone through demographic transformations, so think about Hispanic populations. So Hispanics are becoming an increasingly large portion of the population. But as Hispanics have become a larger portion of the population, right, then also representation, while not perfect, they don't have equal representation in Congress, representation has also risen, right? So for Hispanics, for example, they become a bigger part of the population. You have more Hispanic representatives in Congress, but not true for seculars, right? So you have more seculars, but not more representation in Congress. That there's still that like very significant gap. It's a great question, Gary. So my question really is that, so seculars are this huge portion of the Democratic Party. And I'm focusing on the Democratic Party just for kind of simplicity's sake. I think it's become clear that the Democratic Party is sort of the logical home for seculars. But I'm happy to talk about secularism in the Republican Party too, because that's a separate but also incredibly fascinating story. So my question is really, you have this big chunk of voters, potential participants in the Democratic Party, essentially no representation. So what's the potential of this group? What impact could seculars and non-religious Americans have in politics in general, but especially in the Democratic Party? So that's the main thing I want to talk about. And then I'm definitely happy to I have a whole bunch of slides, after this thing to talk about any sort of different little things that you want to talk about. And I'll say kind of what those topics are when I get to the end. All right, another question. Yeah, and feel free to throw up any questions at any time or stop me if you want me to repeat something. Yeah, I will. The Republican Party stuff, because interestingly enough, so if I will take I'll give you a brief preview, Gary, of the Republican Party. So I told you on this slide that Democrats, that they're rising, that seculars are rising as a percentage of the Democratic Party. But guess what? Seculars are also rising as a percentage of the Republican Party. It's not as big of a rise, but if I showed you this exact same thing for Republicans, you would see Republican seculars going from I think it was it's either 7% to 11% or 7% to 12%. So they're actually also rising in the Republican Party. And I can definitely say more about that at the end of the presentation. Okay. So that's my question, right? What is the potential of this group? Could they change the Democratic Party? Could they change politics? What is it going to look like in the next 10 years, the next 15 years? What's going to happen with this group that's huge, but not yet quite politically kind of represented? And one of the reasons why they're not represented, I think at least, is because there are some barriers to secular participation in party politics, right? So we think that sometimes it's hard for groups to become involved in politics. Sometimes it's easy, but sometimes it's hard. And sometimes there are these barriers for groups to get representation in politics. And one, I think, big barrier, although the existence of your group is certainly kind of bucking this trend, right, is that seculars really have, I feel fairly confident in saying this, even though one of the things I study pretty extensively is secular organizations. Seculars in general have a lack of organizational structure and leadership. And of course, there are a lot of secular organizations, as your organization proves. But if you would just for 1 second kind of think about the seculars or atheists or free thought Americans in comparison to something like the Catholic Church, right? So sure, there are secular groups and organizations. Sure, they kind of have become even a little bit more active in politics and active in lobbying and that sort of thing. And Judy, perfect, secular Democrats in Florida actually did see that. There's also now a secular Democrats national group. So this is changing, and I'm going to kind of talk about more how it's changing. But it doesn't look anything like the organizational structure of, say, a religious tradition. The Catholic Church, for example, has a deeply embedded, deeply hierarchical organizational structure that goes back 2,000 years, is very involved in American politics, has a lot of organizational influence in American politics. You know, the American Council of Bishops, you know, they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of lobbying, they have a lot of connections, all this sort of stuff. And seculars don't have that as of right now. You know, they just don't have that same organizational structure and presence and same kind of lobbying efforts when compared to religious groups or even other types of groups. So that's kind of a barrier to their influence in politics in general. The second barrier is that even though seculars are now the largest part of the Democratic Party at 28%, if you just compare seculars to non-seculars or religious Democrats, they're still in the minority, right? So there's still this kind of divide in the Democratic Party. Again, I'm not even talking about the Republican Party, I'm just talking about the Democratic Party here. There's still a divide in the Democratic Party between religious and non-religious members. And I think I really like this quote from this op-ed in the, I think it was in the Washington Post in 2000. This is really embarrassing. I can't remember when the op-ed was. I think this op-ed was in 2017, but it might have been 2018. But it's a really good one. It's called The Democrats' Religion Problem. And the quote I really like is yet now younger secular Democrats are attempting to separate their party's progressive values from those religious traditions. So it's just highlighting that, okay, sure, seculars are a rising part of the Democratic Party, but still the Democratic Party is mostly religious, just like the population of the United States is mostly religious. So there's that tension there. And this actually has electoral consequences. So in a piece for the Washington Post blog, The Monkey Cage, if you've never heard of The Monkey Cage, it's a really good source for political information. The posts are written by political scientists, but they're written in a way that, you know, is easily understandable by anyone. So we wrote this piece for the Monkey Cage blog, and we were looking at if secular voters or non-religious voters were supporting their party's nominee for president in 2016, Hillary Clinton, at the same rate that evangelicals were supporting Donald Trump. And what we found, yep, exactly. The Monkey Cage, yep, Judy, The Monkey Cage. It's called The Monkey Cage blog. It's on the Washington Post. Yeah, it's really good. So we wanted to see if seculars supported Hillary Clinton, their party's nominee, as much as evangelicals supported Donald Trump. And what we found was no, that seculars just didn't kind of support Hillary Clinton as much as evangelicals supported Donald Trump. So that's another barrier, because if we think seculars are going to be a really important part of the Democratic Party, or kind of want to be an important part of the Democratic Party, it's a little bit of evidence that they're still not integrated into the party as much as maybe they should be. So Donald Trump is not evangelical, you know, and he's not he's certainly not in line with kind of traditional evangelical morality, but he's still got more support than George W. Bush, for example, from evangelicals. So evangelicals are strongly in the Republican Party, and I would say that secular voters are not as strongly in the Democratic Party as evangelicals are in the Republican Party, at least not yet. And the third barrier, the third reason why it's kind of been hard for seculars to get involved in the Democratic Party, is that the Democratic Party itself has really made, from what I can tell until very recently, which I'm going to talk about, essentially no effort to really reach out to seculars as a voting bloc, as a group, as an ideology, as anything. You would think that the Democratic Party, who is very interested in representing every kind of identity in its own party, right? So even if kind of a certain type of identity makes up a very small minority in the Democratic Party, they often get a lot of attention because the Democratic Party wants to highlight that they're kind of the party of representation. Despite this, seculars, at least until recently, have had almost no real kind of representation in the Democratic Party through attention. You know, Democratic candidates aren't talking about secularism. They aren't really talking about non-religious people. Barack Obama mentioned non-religious Americans in one of his speeches. You know, people went crazy because it was sort of the first time that any Democrat of any note had ever really even kind of recognized that there's this huge group of people that's kind of springing up in the American public. But there really is nothing. And I can sort of talk a lot more about this and what my evidence for saying there is no attention from the Democratic Party towards seculars. But there's not a lot. And I'm gonna, again, it's changing a little bit, but I think it's a significant barrier that the Democratic Party is not reaching out to them. And again, compare it to a group like Hispanics or like Black Americans, when we think the Democratic Party is making massive outreach efforts to these groups to show that they are the party of Hispanics, the party of, you know, Black Americans, even the party of LGBTQ individuals, but they're really not doing that for secular Americans. Seculars voters should not consider that their philosophy is as important a part of their lives as religionists do. Jim, that is a very excellent point, and is also, and this is something that we can definitely talk a lot more about, and is also changing, is also definitely changing. So that's kind of the bad news, right? I've given you just sort of oh, seculars aren't, there are all of these barriers to secular involvement in the Democratic Party. But there's one big plus in kind of the, you know, the credits column, or the credits column. I was never good at accounting. There's one big plus for seculars and their involvement in the Democratic Party, and that is secular activism. So it's true that, you know, secular voters maybe not, in general, don't support the candidates of the Democratic Party as much as religionists do the Republican Party. But a certain section of seculars are very active in the Democratic Party and very aware of their identities as seculars and very involved in expressing those identities in the Democratic Party. And these are what I'm calling, and what my dissertation was about, secular activists. So this could take a lot of different forms. You know, a secular activist could be a member of a secular organization who's very involved. You know, somebody who, like yourselves, showing up to meetings, you know, talking about it with other people. You know, that's certainly a form of secular activism. Another form of secular activism, and what I want to talk about today, because I think it might be something that maybe you're very familiar with it, but maybe you're a little bit less familiar with it, is our political activists. So these are people that are very involved in the political party, but who are also secular. So you can think of these folks as convention delegates. So this is a kind of shot in the dark, and I'll see if I can look at everybody's face to see, or throw it up in the chat. Has anybody ever been a delegate to a state or even national party convention? It's unlikely, but I thought I'd ask because it's possible. So, so delegates to state and national, but has everybody certainly heard of national delegates, right? Delegates to the national political party conventions, the conventions that nominate the president, the party's nominee for president. So in order to nominate the in minor party, oh, okay, cool, Jim. If minor party, yes. Oh, so you were a delegate in a different party, that, like, not a Republican or Democratic Party? That's cool. Which party? I can't hear you. You can type it in the chat, or you can jump on and tell me. Okay. You're muted. Delegate. Oh, Libertarian Party. Okay, got it. Yeah, so perfect, yeah. So these are just, if you're a delegate for a political party, you are sort of elected there or nominated there to make decisions. At the national level, these are the people that are picking the party's nominee. So, all right, hop on. I thought I heard somebody hop on. Okay. Socialist Party. Oh, Jim. Okay, good. Oh, good. We have like sort of two sides of it, like Socialist Party and Libertarian Party. So delegates are the people that are really involved in political parties. They're making decisions about the party's platform. They're doing a lot of like activity. You know, you can think of a party activist as the person on your Facebook, and maybe this is you, I don't know, the person on your Facebook that's always talking about politics, always trying to get you to vote, has a bunch of signs, has a bunch of bumper stickers, you know, is going to the conventions, is talking to other Democrats, is volunteering at the local offices, volunteering on campaigns. You know, these are kind of political activists. But I was really interested at kind of how many of these people are seculars. You know, how many people that are politically active, how many of these political activists in the Democratic Party are themselves secular. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, to try to uncover secular activism kind of from the other way, to think about them in terms of politics. So I thought, I don't know, I got the idea that y'all were sort of pretty science-minded, so I kept my slides about hypotheses and stuff. I thought you might appreciate that. If you don't, just humor me for a little bit. But I kind of have a couple expectations, we'll call them, about, we like to, in the social sciences, we like to pretend that we're real scientists, so we do hypotheses and things like this. My joke is that you can always tell if a academic discipline is not a real science, like chemistry or like biology, because they always say science in the name. So it's like political science. Well, it's not a real science, so we have to pretend by just doing it in our name. Big on science. So my first hypothesis is that essentially what I just talked about, that seculars are less active in party politics than non-seculars because of these barriers. So my first hypothesis, I just want to see if there are really these barriers within the Democratic Party. But my second two hypotheses are about representation. Is it possible that seculars would be more active if they could get representation? Would representation kind of motivate them to be more active in politics? Or at the very least, would seculars themselves support secular candidates for public office? We don't have any secular candidates. We have some secular candidates actually this cycle, but we don't have really any national secular candidates. But I want to know, would they support these? Could they become active in that way? So those are my two kind of hypotheses. And to uncover these hypotheses, what we did is we did a survey. Myself and several other researchers, both at the University of Notre Dame. Rachel Bloom's now at the University of Oklahoma. Hans Noel is at Georgetown. And we did the survey of Democrats and Republicans. Again, I'm just going to focus on Democrats for this talk. It's a little bit easier. But we surveyed these state convention delegates. So these are people that are active at the state level. So they're not national convention delegates. They're not local kind of activists. They're kind of in that middle ground. So if you didn't know, each political party in each state has state conventions where they send people, and at these state conventions, they're electing their national delegates. So this is sort of at the state level where people get together, they vote on state party platforms, they do all sorts of kind of state stuff, whatever the heck they do. So we surveyed the Democratic Party in Texas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Washington. And the reason that we surveyed those parties is because those are the parties that would share with us their lists of activists. So, if anybody knows anybody in the Florida Democratic Party that wants to, share, or the Republican Party that wants to share their list of activists, definitely let me know. Would be very grateful for that. As you can sort of imagine, political parties are not so trusting of academics, even on the Democratic Party side. But anyway, this is kind of what we were able to do, and we think it's a pretty good sample. Scientific problems, let's see, multifaceted crisis of the natural world. Oh yeah, we can talk about science. That's definitely one thing that we can talk about. I've been researching a lot about science. So overall, we had 5,600 respondents. So 5,600 state delegates responded to our survey. And about half those are Democrats and half are Republicans. But again, I'm just talking about the Democrats. And so I wanted to see how many of these people are seculars, right? So I told you that non-religious people, or just people that are nuns that don't identify with the religious tradition, are now 25, 26, 27, 28% of the population. But I wanted to see, two, whose question was it? To Jim's point, that lots of people don't see themselves as secular. I wanted to see what percentage of these political party, these Democratic political party activists, saw themselves as secular, really thought of themselves as secular. And I used two strategies in combination to do that. First, I asked them, do you I had a long list of words that they could sort of identify with. And if you checked off secular, atheist, or agnostic, I said, hey, you're secular. And then I wanted to even put sort of a bigger kind of qualification on it. I asked them questions about their secular beliefs. So questions like, which you might relate to. Hopefully these questions ring true with you because we developed them to capture kind of secular ideology. Things like factual evidence from the natural world is the source of true beliefs. So trying to get at the kind of fact versus God kind of thing. And then kind of the opposite, values are more important than factual evidence in making moral decisions. So I wanted to see essentially how many of these political activists were secular. You know, how many of them really thought about themselves as secular. And in many ways, the most surprising and to me interesting and important finding of this research project was the simplest. And that was that among Democratic Party's state convention delegates, so people that are incredibly active in the Democratic Party, you know, people that are really involved in politics, people that are trying to shape politics, people that are voting on party platforms, people that are electing the nominee for president of the United States, among those people, 38% identified or were classified, at least by me, as secular. 38%. So this is much more than the general public, right? So if I applied this same classification, which is really strict, you know, which is pretty strict, it's not just not identifying with a religion, you know, it's all this other stuff. It's like saying, yes, I am secular, I believe in these types of things. So if we apply that to just Democrats and the general public, that's only like 12 to 15% of Democrats, you know, really think of themselves as secular and sort of believe in secular things. But 38% of activists in the Democratic Party think of themselves as very, you know, very secular, which is a huge number to me. I don't know what y'all think about that. That's a really intense number, which means that, you know, about 40% of the people that are shaping how the Democratic Party operates, or at least on the activist level, are seculars. So the other thing I wanted to see is like, okay, we have this huge group of seculars that are really active in politics and active in the Democratic Party. Are there, all right, let me get to the chat. What, oh my gosh, okay. Many people, I think you say non-religious mean they don't follow a form of religion, but still believe in God. Yeah, so that's a great question. So this does not, this number that I said, 38%, does not include those people. So it's not people that just don't believe in God. If you just define secular as just people who don't believe in God, then this number is like 75%. So like 75% of people like don't have a religious tradition in the Democratic Party among activists. But this is not that. It's people who actively say, yes, I'm secular, yes, I'm atheist, yes, I'm agnostic, and also believe in things like, you know, agree with these statements about factual evidence. So it's not people that believe in God. Even, you know, it's not people without a religion that say they don't believe in God. Really good question. I feel like if I missed your question somewhere in there, I looked at a lot of questions, just type it again. So I did want to like see if there were these barriers, right? If seculars were experiencing these barriers. And one way to do that is just to see if seculars or non-seculars were more or less likely to be involved in elected office or even the party offices. So like elected office, parties also have their own elected offices. You know, you can sort of be a party leader. And so I wanted to see if seculars, so seculars, again, huge part of the party, but are they as involved as their non-secular counterparts as we would expect, given how big of a part of the activist kind of base they are? And then I also wanted to see if they had previous involvement in sort of the national or state conventions. This is just, I just threw this in here. You don't have to pay attention to this. Just know that like in the graphs that I'm going to show you, we account for things like gender, race, education, income, where you live, your political ideology even. So we're counting all that with some statistics stuff. Don't worry about it. I just close it. You just get the statistics to say whatever you want, right? That's not true. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so if you look at this graph on the, I guess it's your left-hand side of the screen, this is just a comparison between essentially the percentage of delegates that have held a party office. So on your very far left, it's non-secular delegates that have held a party office. And on your right, it's secular delegates that have held a party office. And again, I'm not going to get too complicated. You know, we use statistics to kind of compare these two groups more specifically. But what you can see there is that secular delegates are much less likely to have held a party office than their non-secular counterparts, even accounting for the fact that they are, see, Mark 29, exactly. There you go, Jim, exactly. So, so you can see that even accounting for all that other stuff, even accounting for the fact that seculars are only 40% of state delegates, they're still much less likely to hold an upper level party office. So something is kind of limiting their involvement in politics, and especially in party politics. And the same is true for holding a public office, right? So seculars are just so much less likely than non-seculars to have held a public office. So something is really holding seculars back even within the Democratic Party. And then the same story is true for whether or not, that's hard to understand. The same story is true for whether or not they have been a delegate to a national convention. So seculars are more likely to be new delegates and less likely to be national convention delegates. So just again, kind of showing that seculars are just not as involved in party politics as they should be and as they want to be. You know, people are activists because they want to be involved, and there's something that's really holding them back. And then lastly, I wanted to see if seculars would support a secular candidate for public office. And we use this question to kind of get at that. It says, many state constitutions prohibit people who do not believe in God from holding public office. What do you think about people who do not believe in God holding public office? And we give them 4 different choices. So we ask them, oh, people who do not believe in God should not be allowed to hold public office. The second choice is people who do not believe in God should be allowed to hold public office, but I wouldn't vote for somebody that didn't believe in God. The third choice is that people who believe in God should be allowed to hold public office, but I don't know if I would vote for them because they didn't believe in God. And then the last choice, and most importantly for our purposes, is people who do not believe in God should be allowed to hold public office, and I would be more likely to vote for that person because they did not believe in God. Who would choose to go into politics? Nobody, Eileen. Nobody would choose to go into politics. Eileen, the only people that go into politics are people that are you don't want to be in politics. Are people that are told. That's the whole problem right there. Is that the only people that are crazy enough to go into politics are the people that you don't want there in the first place. You know what I'm saying? So it's a whole mess. But but nobody would choose to go into politics. So if you look, so just if you would for 2 seconds, focus on those kind of right 2 groups of bars. So the kind of third group of bars, the tallest one, is a breakdown of people who say, oh, people who don't believe in God should be allowed to hold public office, but I don't know if I'd vote for them or not, just because they don't believe in God. And so here you see a big gap between secular, this is moving on its own, secular Democrats and non-secular Democrats. So non-secular Democrats are much more likely to say like they should be allowed, but I don't know if I'd vote for them or not. And then if you move to the far right, the far right sort of cluster of bars, the far right 2 bars, you see an even bigger difference. And that difference is that Democratic seculars are much more likely by 5 times to say, oh, I do think that people should be allowed to hold public office who do not believe in God, and I'd be more likely to vote for that person because they don't believe in God. So seculars really are kind of asking for this representation. They're asking for this involvement, but they're limited because what? There are clearly barriers within the Democratic Party to their involvement, and 2, there just aren't any secular elected officials, right? There are not any secular candidates for them to vote for. There are very few even state offices that have ever had a secular candidate for public office, although there are some important exceptions. So the main takeaways from this section, at least from this part, and then I'll shut up and let you ask questions, or we can kind of go off in another direction if you want, are just those 2 things, right? Like seculars are facing significant barriers, again, in the Democratic Party. I'm not talking about the Republican Party here. I'm not talking about the party that's overly religious, that's evangelical, that's all this sort of stuff, that is clearly sort of anti-secular in many ways. Although I can definitely talk more about the Republican Party. But in the Democratic Party, there are barriers to seculars being involved within the Democratic Party. But they want to be, right? They're showing up, they're clearly trying to be involved, and they would definitely respond to a secular candidate for public office. So again, you have a huge percentage of the population that's secular, that's also extremely active in politics. There's just no one, from my research, kind of like my angle is that there's just no one capturing this group. There's nobody reaching out to this group. There's nobody trying to leverage this group in kind of an electoral sense. So that's kind of where I think seculars are. They're kind of like on the precipice of having a lot of religious influence. Just like, if you can remember back to the 1960s and the early 1970s, evangelical Christians were not partisan and not really involved in politics. It took leaders of both the evangelical movement and the Republican Party to kind of reach out to evangelicals. And it might take the same kind of thing to happen here, that the party needs to reach out to seculars. But seculars themselves are also starting to demand their kind of representation. So I said that things were changing, and my last little thing that I've saved to the end is that things are changing for seculars. That while I said there are no members of Congress that are openly secular, there's actually only one, Jamie Raskin, who you see. In 2019, Jamie and a few other members of Congress did start the Secular Caucus, or it's not called the Secular Caucus, it's called the Free Thought Caucus, sorry. And he said in 2019, in a speech about the Free Thought Caucus, he said, "We need a secular movement that is big and strong and aggressive, and we'd like to consider ourselves the parliamentary arm of it." And so there is starting to, even though most of these people don't identify as secular or don't identify as non-religious, there is some sort of representation starting to occur. And then I don't know if you all saw this, but it's really important and kind of monumental for secular representation in the Democratic Party. In 2019, at the summer meeting of the DNC, they put forth this resolution that is explicitly saying that we believe that the rights and views of religiously unaffiliated Americans ought to be protected. So yeah, Eileen, but it's changing, Eileen, it's changing, Eileen. So there is some outreach, there is some kind of move to reach out to secular and non-religious Americans. So it's changing a little bit, but we're kind of seeing the evolution of that as we speak. And then the three things that we can talk about if you want to, I have some more like cool experiments that we've done to prove that people support secular candidates for public office. I've done a lot more research on secular organizations I'm happy to talk about. And then I've done, my new research program is specifically about science and how people's attitudes about science affect their politics. So those are kind of some things that I can talk about if you want to. Sorry, I think I've gone way over time, but as with all academics, I love to hear myself talk. So that's all. If people want to jump up and ask questions or anything like that, please feel free. I think a couple people put some stuff in the chat.
It went so fast, that means it was enjoyable.
Oh, okay, good. I talk fast too, which is not a good thing. I need to slow down.
Oh, yeah. Well, I need to learn how to pronounce my R's.
You and me both. Eileen, as soon as I learn English, I'll let you know, and we can sort of get on.
Move to England. It's the only way, because they really, that's the only way you learn to speak. Unless, where's Andrea? I had a friend that said she'll teach me. Too late.
Right.
All right, sorry, I'm gone.
No, it's okay. I have a statement and a question for you.
Yeah.
This year, we surveyed the candidates for State House of Representatives, State Senate, and the U.S. House of Representatives from Florida.
Right.
Sent out maybe close to 250, 300 requests. Nobody from the U.S. House, no candidate from the U.S. House of Representatives responded, period.
Yeah, they're not going to.
A few from the Senate, Florida Senate responded, maybe 10, and about 40 for the Florida House of Representatives responded. And I'm stuck. Sorry.
That's good. Oh yeah, I mean, you're never going to get them to respond to you.
I was surprised at how many actually responded.
Yeah, that's a good number.
Because we did earlier in the year, before the primaries, we surveyed school board members in the 10 largest counties in Florida and got very few responses.
Right.
I've not looked at the breakdown on Democrat and Republican. I don't have any of that. I mean, I can get that information, but I've not analyzed it in that sense. Because we're not, it's a nonpartisan survey and it's being posted as nonpartisan. But
Right.
I was amazed at how many, not all of them were secular by any means, but I was just amazed at how many, under the guise, the letterhead was Atheists of Florida, and that they responded at all. Surprising.
Yeah.
And this is Florida.
Right. I agree. That's amazing. If you talk to some of the people that do some of the organization for the Secular Coalition of America, they do these presentations. I will, yeah, Gary, I will in like 2 seconds. That's a good point. They do these presentations and you hear them say a lot of things like, oh, state senators will come up to me and say, oh, I really don't believe in God, but I kind of just have to get reelected. You know, so there are a lot of kind of like secret atheists, you know, secret seculars in government for sure. And yeah, so quickly on Eileen's point about secular equals socialism for most, I think maybe that's true. I mean, I think that that's sort of true. Although, interesting, what I would say to that is that more and more socialism is not a dirty word, especially in the Democratic Party. So there is definitely a link, I think, between sort of a Bernie Sanders type supporter, a socialist person, and like a secular person. You know, so if you think about like a Hillary Clinton supporter versus a Bernie supporter, certainly the Bernie supporter is going to be more likely to be secular than, you know, the Hillary Clinton supporter, but not as much as you might think. And also, even the Hillary Clinton supporter now is not anti-secular, and they're not anti-socialism either, in the same way that they would have been even 5 or 10 years ago. So
well, every time I post things about that, I have these little, I use cartoons all the time because people can think their own thing. And it's, you know, I guess it's the one of Jesus, you know, saying, you know, take care of the poor, take care of this. And there's Trump going, you know, socialism. So I point this out to all of my religious friends because they don't seem to get it, that is what the problem is that they're well, you know how it is. It's I do it subtly because I can't really tell them who to vote for, you know, but I want them to realize that's what, to me, he's socialism is I don't know. That's what my dad was a Teamster for 75 years. Union workers, you know, I mean, that's what to me is what's good about socialism. Okay, I'm off.
I like this comment too, that Trump is a secret non-religious thing. I don't even think it's a secret. I mean, I say it all the time that in many ways, Donald Trump is the most individually secular candidate for public office that we've ever had, and certainly the most individually secular president we've ever had by far. I mean, I don't even think that's controversial to say personally. I think that he is very supportive of the agenda of evangelical Christianity, you know, particularly, and sort of maybe even kind of white Catholicism and maybe even sort of religious Americans more generally. But on an individual level, I don't even think it's particularly controversial to, like, I don't think evangelicals think that he's very religious. I think that we
don't want them saying that he's an atheist, because I did find someplace that said he must be an atheist. And I'm like, hey, we don't want him. Same thing with that Spencer idiot. You know, it's like, you know, we don't want the bad side. We want the scientific. And he's getting there.
That's so funny. Yeah. But yeah, in many ways, I say it all the time. I say he's, and I mean, the crazy truth is that in some ways he is the first kind of, sort of the most secular president we've ever had, which is just a crazy thing, of course.
Yeah, Jim, I was thinking that I saw a BBC documentary this afternoon, in fact, analyzing Trump's position in the religiously conservative South, in North Carolina in this case, and which ran about 5 or 6 clips in which Trump indicated that he was fervently religious. And I think it was another one of his lies, of course, but nevertheless, he's gotten a large number of dedicated religious people to believe him on this point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of, I don't want to say fake. I mean, I think he sort of is religious enough to make them happy is sort of would be my take on it. And I think the bigger point is just simply if you're an evangelical Republican Christian, you know, the thing that the sort of evangelical right has been fighting for in American politics for 50 years, you know, has been the abortion issue. And so Trump has gotten you closer to that than you've ever been before in the last 50 years. And so in some ways, my standard line is like, it doesn't matter, and that if he's religious or not, because he's doing the things they want. And they're right. I mean, they're right in the sense that Donald Trump has gotten them as close to that as anyone has. So, and if you kind of look at it in terms of issues and representation of issues, I think the truth is that he has done that for them. So it makes sense. And that my prediction would be that evangelical support for Donald Trump will be just as high, if not higher, in the election coming up than it was in 2016. And it was already extremely high in 2016. Again, not by much, but evangelicals supported Donald Trump in 2016 more than they supported George W. Bush in either of his two elections. And George W. Bush is a very, by all rights, kind of a very committed evangelical Christian. So it's, it's a really interesting kind of dynamic. But yeah, and somebody asked earlier, said, be sure to mention secularism, Republican Party. So not only is it on the rise, but if you do the same sort of analysis that I did on the Democratic Party, on the Republican Party, in some ways, not always, in some ways you don't actually find the same barriers to secular involvement in the Republican Party that you do in the Democratic Party. So you would think that the Republican Party, at least in terms of its structure or whatever, would be super restrictive of seculars, people that don't believe in God. You can think of sort of like a Ron Paul atheist kind of a person, somebody said sort of a libertarian kind of atheist, Republican kind of a thing. They're actually, I think because the Republican Party is seen as religious as a whole, they don't really fear the rise of minority kind of atheism or secularism in the party. So they're just not paying as much attention to it. So they're actually, one argument is that there just aren't the same barriers to secular involvement in the Republican Party as there are in the Democratic Party. Now, okay, if there were 25%, if 25% of the Republican Party was secular, that might change. They might say, whoa, like we don't want these people in our party. But as of now, you kind of, it's a completely different dynamic, at least from what I've seen from our research.
But do you think that's going to change since so many people have left the Republican Party with Trump?
Yeah, I think, okay, so the first thing that I would sort of exercise caution on is the statement, so many people have left the Republican Party because of Trump. We don't quite know how many people have left the Republican Party because of Trump. We will find out in 3 or 4 weeks how many people have really, how many people are really not going to vote for the Republican? That's the big question, right? Like, people say they don't like him, people say yada, 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 but how many people are really not going to vote for the Republican incumbent president when it comes down to brass tacks? And then the second thing is that the people that are going to leave the Republican Party are not going to be evangelical Christians, right? They're not going to be white Catholics. They're going to be these people that I just talked about in many ways, kind of a more traditionally conservative Republican, maybe even a less religious Republican. And so what you're going to have left, if you do that, what you're going to have left over in the Republican Party is going to be a more religious, in many ways, possibly a more religious Republican Party than has ever been. So I don't think we quite know how this whole thing is going to shake out. And actually, I don't think that we will know for maybe even 4 more years until we see the next candidate and the next kind of batch of members of Congress that the Republican Party starts to kind of put forward. Yeah, Gary, I agree that that it's just, we don't quite, So maybe it might happen, and there are definitely some signs that it is starting to happen, that people are kind of defecting, especially going toward Joe Biden. But we don't know. We don't know.
I have another aside that's not related directly to what you've been talking about.
Sure.
How does one explain the Supreme Court makeup being predominantly Catholic?
This is such a great question, Judy. And Catholic and Jewish, right? So we talked about this. We talked about Judy. Judy. Have you been coming to my class? We talked about this on Thursday. So the answer is I have no idea. I don't think anybody really knows. It's so fascinating. It's such a weird thing. It's like It's like most presidents are left-handed. Did you know that? It's almost, for me, it's almost like that. Now, I could give you some answers about legitimacy, about how the kind of person that is considered for a position as a Supreme Court justice is going to be a member of kind of one of these kind of more institutionalized religious traditions. I could say something about how evangelical Christianity is really it's something that we kind of put onto people. It's not something that people really, evangelical Christianity is not like a denomination, like Catholic is a denomination. But a huge majority, certainly a disproportionate majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholic and Jewish in ways that we actually do think influences their decisions. We do think that there's some influence of their particular religious tradition on their decisions, and also how they kind of write decisions, how they interact with all this sort of stuff. And the answer, this is one of these things that we just have not answered. It's why they kind of, and it's one explanation which I do like is that they're kind of neutral. They're sort of neutral religions, right? Catholics are kind of traditionally in the middle. Also, the Jewish people are kind of, they have some conservative aspects, some sort of more liberal aspects. Same for Catholics. Catholics are, say, for example, sort of anti-abortion, but often pro kind of social justice. So they make good justices because they're not too radical. But you have people like Amy Coney Barrett, who is pretty radical even despite being a Catholic. So I don't know.
Part of the reason why Catholics and Jews tend to be among those picked most frequently is because they come from traditions that have a certain amount of high-profile scholarship associated with them.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
and so there's that kind of discipline that might influence those who pick them.
Yeah, I like that answer too. I think that's a good answer. Yep, that both their religious traditions are kind of have an element, and really a strong element of scholarship, and that feeds into being a Supreme Court justice. That's a good answer. I'm gonna steal it, Jim. I'll cite you. I'll say Jim. I'll say in conversation with Jim.
I'll expect my license fees anytime.
Jim, I will give Jim, I will give you 50% of the license fees that I get when I write an article.
All right,
we'll put it right down the middle. 50% is zero. You can have.
They're worth more than that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I totally. One of the things that I thought, when I was an undergrad thinking about becoming a professor, because you always hear the same old line, publish or perish. So I thought that meant professors had to publish books and articles because that's how they got paid. Like you sort of publish an article or book, and then people read it, and then they pay you money for that. And that is not the case. We don't get any money from any of these things at all, because the only people that read it are other scholars often, and then even the only people that are buying the books are libraries and stuff like that. So we rarely, if ever, get any big royalty checks from the stuff.
You just assumed the wrong connective. It's publish and perish.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right.
So Joe, did you have a question? Joe Reinhardt, did you have a question?
Joe.
Hello, Joe. Wake up.
Hey, Joe.
No, guess not. James, did you have a question?
It's not Nancy Pressing.
I would just like to say that I appreciate these statistics. However, I think that one of the things that I would really like to find researched and statistics provided is the demographic of Democrats and Republicans who think of themselves or support ideologies, different ideologies, such as authoritarianism, socialism, fascism, racism, these various metrics, how they are represented within the political parties. I think that that would be a very interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, all that stuff is so obviously since the kind of age of Trump, but even before then, people were paying a lot more attention to authoritarianism. And authoritarianism, I think, is a fun political science story because the way that we measure authoritarianism on a survey is by attitudes about parenting. So I'll ask you, I can't ask you if you're a Nazi, right? Like I can't say to somebody, oh, are you a fascist? I mean, some people will say yes, but not that many, you know. I mean, people are ever so slightly smarter than that. Not by much, but ever so slightly smart. So you ask them about their attitudes about parenting, you know, like, do you prefer things like strict discipline or is it better to let kids do what they want? There's kind of a battery of questions that we ask. And I think it was Mark Hetherington that wrote a sort of, it's now a famous book because he wrote it in 2009 and he looked at the survey data on authoritarianism and said that the United States was moving, and especially the Republican Party, but there's some, as you mentioned, there's some authoritarianism in the Democratic Party as well. He said that America was moving in a more authoritarian direction, and he actually, you know, to his credit, sort of predicted the rise of an authoritarian leader. And so he's kind of credited with sort of predicting the presidency of Donald Trump. But there is a rise in that. It's definitely since the Trump presidency, there's been a ton more research on authoritarianism and people's attitudes about authoritarianism, fascism, and these types of things. One article that it's a bit related, is something that I saw really recently that stuck with me, is that how you view kind of the government's response to protests and whether or not you judge that protest as violent is very political. So it's not just that, oh, Republicans see like the Proud Boys or another type of far right group being violent and they're kind of supportive of that. And it's not that, it's that Democrats actually don't see a bias, right? So if you show Democrats pictures of right-wing protesters and left-wing protesters throwing rocks, a Democrat will say, okay, that's violence, right? No matter who's throwing the rock, the Democrat will say, okay, that's a violent protest. But the Republican will say that the person throwing the rock matters, basically. So if you show them a picture of a right-wing person throwing a rock, they won't see that as violence. But if you show them a picture of a left-wing, you know, like a left-wing person throwing a rock, they will see it as violence. And subsequently, they'll be a little bit more accepting of violence against the protesters to sort of tamp that down, right? So one thing that we talk a lot about in class, especially because I'm sort of really, I don't want authoritarianism, so I try to get the students like, oh, that's not a good thing. We talk a lot about how violence legitimizes authoritarianism, and often that violence comes from the people that are supportive of the authoritarian ruler, right? So right now you see a lot of right-wing groups being very violent in protests, and that is very political because it gets Republicans to be more accepting of the government cracking down on left-wing protesters, which is a crazy thing, but there is a much bigger rise, especially now that we see mass protests.
I'd like also to see statistics on issues, social issues, like, for example, within the Democratic Party, the percentage of Democrats who would support taking immigrants arriving at the border who are seeking asylum from violence in their home countries? How many Democrats would support the idea of placing these people in detention centers and ripping their children from their arms and placing them in cages and horrible conditions? And as opposed to how many within the Republican Party how their reaction would be to that. And also things like banning books.
Yeah.
What percentage of Republicans support the idea that we should ban books so that people cannot be exposed to so-called dangerous ideas, versus how many people within the Democratic Party, and if you don't want to make it political, just make it ideological, conservative versus liberal.
Yeah.
Because I think that these statistics would be very, very, very interesting in revealing the character of conservatism versus the character of liberalism.
Right. Jim, I really like that. I like that banning books thing, actually. I really like it. And I don't remember off the top of my head if I've seen research on banning books. I like that as a question and to like get at kind of an authoritarianism thing. I have seen a fair bit of research on immigration and people's kind of willingness to, separate, because, once this happens, like lots of people try to do research on it. And, as you would expect, obviously Democrats are very much against that. Republicans are more accepting, although certainly not universally so. I think even within the Republican Party, there is sort of, there's kind of a hesitation there. And then the other thing that is sort of related that I'll say too is that Donald Trump is very capable of pushing people in his direction in terms of what he wants people to believe. So we do these experiments where we put Donald Trump on either side of an issue. So say, for example, Donald Trump might be pro-immigration or anti-immigration. And it doesn't matter which side you put him on. Republicans, especially really strong Republicans, will just follow him to either side. So there is your point, like to your point about ideology, it's not even so much about ideology or even party. It's about basically what Donald Trump says kind of goes, and that's sort of an interesting thing. Eileen, couldn't be more right, Eileen. Statistics aren't always reliable. Definitely not. Way too many variables, 100%. That's all I do. I just sit at my computer all day like variables, variables, variables. It's like way too many freaking variables.
It may be that statistics are not absolutely on the mark, but they do suggest to us the reality in the world.
Yeah,
because
so
people answer these questionnaires. It's not like these are spit out by robots. People share their opinions and they don't realize it, but they're being monitored by people who are gathering data on what their ideologies are and how they view freedom, equality, and social equity.
You definitely won't find. You won't. I even though I do statistics for a living, I definitely tend to be critical of them in the sense that I try to be super clear about their limitations. They're good at some things and they're not good at others, just like any tool. They're really good at looking at broad relationships between things among a large number of people. So if I want to know what the US population thinks, then I can't ask her. I can't sit down and have a conversation with every US citizen. So I have to do something that kind of represents their interests. But if I want to know what's going on, what's going on in a meeting of, the Atheist Society of Florida Atheists on a Monday or whatever day you meet, in a January, if I want to know this kind of stuff that's going on in the way that people are talking about it, you can't capture that sort of thing with statistics. You have to dig deeper into talking to people and figuring those things out. So they're good at some stuff, not good at other stuff at all. But
one thing you can do is be the fly on the wall and listen to the conversation in these various meetings. For example, if you go to a Republican meeting where Mitt Romney characterizes the 47% as scumbags who never contribute anything, you get and then everybody in the room applauds.
Right. Yeah.
You get the sense for where the ideology of this group of people.
Right. I also Gary asked me, where's the application audience for your work and research? The parties, think tanks, political consultants, is good stuff. So who seeks to utilize it? Gary, I asked myself that. It just keeps me up all night. You know, if I could ask that question, my mom asked me, she's like, my mom's just like, well, you know, people should listen to you, you know, about politics. You know what you're talking about. And I say to her, I say, Mom, you trust me. I'm your son. You trust me more than anyone, probably. If I told you, oh, well, you should vote for this candidate over this other candidate, are you going to listen to me? And she's like, oh, no, I see your point. No, but actually, but to not tell a joke, I think the real application for this particular work is actually with the political parties, especially the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party is really, and I don't really have a dog in this fight, only that I'm interested in representation more generally. I think people's beliefs and opinions and ideas should be represented in government. You know, I think that's why we have a democracy. And I think that political parties serve a function in that representation. And so I think that the Democratic Party is really, I don't know if purposeful or it's just ignorance, but they're really blind to this entire like movement that's going on outside of their view. And it's trying to bubble up, right? You see all these kind of signs, but they're just not grasping hold of it in a way that they are. You see, one thing you do see, and I haven't talked a lot about, but you do see them talking about science a lot more, which is a way that I have suggested that the party can really reach out to secular individuals without alienating, oh, thanks, Gary, without alienating even religious members of their party. So if you pay attention, they're talking a lot more about science than they used to. It might surprise you actually to know that for most of the last 50 years, it's actually been the Republican Party that, rhetorically at least, has been more supportive of science and technology and things like that in general. It's only very recently, since about 2008, that there's been a really intense conflict over science between the two parties. So I think that, you know, that's one thing I'm listening for, I'm watching out for, is Democratic candidates talking a lot about science to try to, I think, reach out to seculars as a group. And
also, we now have a mainstream media, several channels that are, I think that this is a fact, are propaganda arms of the Republican Party. And if you tune in and listen to the rhetoric, I think you can get a very accurate feel for where they stand on topics like immigration, racism, book banning, and attitudes towards gays and lesbians and atheists. So even though you are not necessarily conducting a survey, a great deal of information about the character of the Republican Party can be gleaned just by listening to them. And they're not lying on Fox News about what they believe. They're telling you the truth about their ideology when they're using these messages.
Yeah, and certainly their votes and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that in general, the candidates kind of are, on both sides, are kind of saying how they're representing ideas in Congress. Rick has a good line, which says that too many people say, oh, I always lie in surveys. Well, the good thing about surveys, Rick, is that they have to lie all in the same direction. See, we're tricky when we design these surveys. And everybody can lie, but just as long as they don't all get together and lie in the same direction, it's fine. It's like this whole ballot thing. You know, people are, oh, the ballots are going to be thrown away by the post office. Okay, well, maybe that'll happen. But in order for it to affect the election, they all have to get together and everybody has to throw away one kind of ballot at once, which is tough to do.
Yeah.
So don't coordinate.
Sorry to interrupt. Anybody else have a question before I have one more thing I wanted to ask you about, but I want to give everybody else a chance to ask questions. No questions. I'm curious as to how people who identify as atheists, which I assume would mean they would be secular, can still support candidates who are catering to the religious right.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, and somebody kind of mentioned something about not about seeing yourself as secular or seeing yourself as atheist. So I think a couple things. First, for some people, maybe it's just not as important as some of their other, concerns. So maybe you are atheist, but you don't, it's not the most important thing to you. Maybe you're just kind of maybe you're sort of a rich person or you're fiscally conservative. And so those considerations are more important to you. Also, I don't know if anybody's sort of familiar with this research about atheism. There are a couple of fun facts about atheism that I think are interesting. One, atheists, as you probably know, are sort of one of the most hated groups in America, right? People just hate atheists for some reason. Also, not a lot of people identify as atheists, but if you do these little survey tricks, we use these things called list experiments to essentially trick people into telling us what they really believe. If you do these sort of tricks to trick people and they get you to tell what they really believe, 35%, as much as 35 or even 40% of the population is willing to say that they don't believe in God, but like 7% only says that they're atheist. And it's like, well, guess what an atheist is? It's somebody who doesn't believe in God. So, it's just a tidbit to put in your, if you ever feel, kind of down and out about being an atheist, just know that there are maybe a third of the population are secret atheists. So that's, and actually, I think it has a lot to do with why people who do identify with atheism and secularism, etc., aren't really quite connecting that identity to their political identity. Do you know? So each of us have all these different identities and attitudes and all this sort of stuff that's going on in our mind, but it really takes something to connect that stuff with politics. It takes maybe a politician to do that, maybe a political party, as I've been saying, to like reach out. Maybe even us to say like, oh, this is the party of Christianity. This is the party of secularism. If you went back to 1960 and you were an evangelical Christian, if it was 1965 and you were a white evangelical Christian in the South, in Florida and Mississippi and Alabama, and wherever, you were a Democrat. Right, you were part of the Southern white Democrats, which is mind blowing. You were part of the Southern white Democrats, right? And so it takes something to attach these. And again, another interesting fun fact: like, who was our first evangelical president? Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, right? So it takes some power and influence to attach these identities to a political party, and it's not a guaranteed thing. I think people like you and people like me, we see this stuff pretty clearly. We think, oh, definitely Democrats are all secular or Republicans are all religious or whatever. But that's not how individuals think of it. And so it takes some energy to attach those identities to a political identity. And it's definitely been happening with religious identities in the Republican Party, certain religious identities in the Republican Party for 40, 50 years. And it's starting to happen, I think, in a more solid way with secularism, atheism, agnosticism in the Democratic Party, although, as I've said, not exclusively. Great question. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for your participation. This has been so great. I've really enjoyed talking with y'all.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime.
Great. I might. So we've done a survey of the American Human Association. I think Eileen said something like, oh, well, they don't ask me. We might be asking you, Eileen. We don't know. We're sending out surveys all the time. So,
Yeah.
So if you see a survey, fill it out. But yeah. And also, I don't, and so we want
the problem I see, and I keep mentioning this to, because you're younger, you understand. My daughter is 36 now, 37, whatever.
Mhm.
I keep forgetting, time passes. She would not admit that she was an atheist because it affects her job. They
Yeah.
look at that Facebook page, whatever you look at. And until we get out of this particular evangelical attitude, that's what bothers me is that, but once you get in that voting booth, supposedly that, even if you tell your boss you're not an atheist, you can
Right.
still vote secular. That's the
Right.
only thing that I think is good.
Right. Yeah. And I think that
So
that's
far.
starting to happen. We'll see.
Yeah.
I'm saying I think Joe Biden has not done as much as I kind of thought the 2020 presidential candidate would do on that
Ugh.
front. But I'm kind of saying like wait till 2024 and see how things happen in 2024. Maybe that's kind of the big year for one of these years. It's going to be like sort of the big secular year is what I think. I'm biased, right? Because it'd be good for my research. So.
Well, yeah.
Aren't we all biased?
Oh yeah, we're all terribly.
Come by us, my Lord. Come by us.
I've really enjoyed your presentation,
Oh, thanks
Yes.
so much.
and it's food for thought. So I probably won't sleep well tonight.
That's fine. If you have any other great thoughts, email me. I'd love to hear what y'all think. I mean, I'm just, we're kind of just looking for ideas because it's tough. It's tough to know exactly what's going on the ground. I've talked to a lot of activists in, Texas and other types of places. Talk to them a lot. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see what's going on actually on the ground. With folks that are, having connections with other groups, having connections with other people, what reactions you get to, people.
I've got a question for you to put on one of your surveys.
I'm already stealing the banning books question.
Okay, so here's the question.
Yeah.
Would you? I'll just say this statement, and then you would survey whether people would support this statement or disagree with it. Okay.
Right.
We should not subject people who are different to malevolent treatment that we ourselves would not like to be subjected to.
Right. Sort of like a golden rule kind of a thing.
Yeah, but I'm putting it in words quite different because you can say, well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and some Nazis responded, if I was a Jew, I would be happy to be executed, so,
Yeah,
but this is a different way of expressing the idea that if you don't like being mistreated, why are you mistreating other people?
Yeah, well, it's the idea, and I'm with you because to me it's the idea at the heart of humanism. If you want to think about having a belief system that's based in humanity, that's humanism. That the human person is sort of the main focus of morality, and I like that. Yeah, I like it's put yourself in this. Would you have something due to you that was done to others? And that's something that we got to dig further into, definitely.
Yeah,
in
that
terms
has
of
to do with their level of empathy.
Yeah.
As well, their ability to identify with people who are different.
Yeah.
And the troubles that they face, their struggles.
Yeah. I wrote it down, Jim. I'm going to cite you for sure.
Okay, thank you so much. I enjoyed your presentation immensely. And I hope that I'll hear from you.
Yeah,
I like to talk to groups of people. I do a lot of YouTube posts.
Oh, cool.
And I know Joe Reinhardt and I have worked together in the past quite a bit.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, we're activists.
Right.
We always make fun of Jim because he looks like he's in a cell, but he's down.
Well, I got a blanket over the bars,
Right.
so you can't see the bars, but they're on the side windows. You can see there's bars up there.
That's fine.
Yeah, and Mark, as president of the local Humanist Society of the Suncoast, I'd like to invite you to come and speak to us, perhaps in the next 6 or 8 months or so.
Oh, sure. I'd love to talk to you. I could even we did a survey of the American Humanist Association. Did a fair bit of research on. I'm sure that's interesting. So yeah,
we'd be fascinated.
I'll tell you all about yourself.
Do we have an email address so we can reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been talking with you, and I can put my other one here too. And then also, frankly, if you just Google my name, Mark Brockway, my website will pop up, and you can just my email's on there.
Okay.
So. Judy has it. I don't. My email, the email that Judy used might not be. It's from Notre Dame still, so it might just forward to my new one. But that's my new one. Syracuse. Sorry, that's the wrong one. What am I doing? Mark Brock at syracuse.edu.
I think you might be sending that to someone you're in private
I
conversation
am
with.
Joe. All right, so Joe has my email, but let me send it to everybody.
I like Facebook. But
I'm not on Facebook.
Nobody is. I'm the only one. I have fun.
But honestly, if you just Google Mark Brockway or Mark Brockway Syracuse, I'll just pop it up.
Yeah.
Well, maybe when you publish your next paper or book, you'll be coming back and soliciting our buying it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm working on a project about science, people's attitudes about science. That's my next.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my next thing.
And I'll try to get Ryan Cragen to come next time.
Yeah, that would be cool. I'll send him an email just for fun about this.
He missed you.
Yeah.
Oh, you grew up in South Bend? That's neat. Yeah. I lived in South Bend for the 5 years I was in Texas. All right, I'll see y'all later.
Okay, bye.